Louisiana State University Medical Center in Shreveport. Involved in medical education, patient care, and research. Presents Medical Center Update.
Primary of the hospital. Good evening and welcome to Medical Center Update. I'm Warren Otterson, the Acting Dean at LSU Medical Center. Tonight we're going to discuss the topic of electromagnetic fields, which is a very controversial area and has received much national press. Privileged this evening to have with me Dr. Andy Marino. Dr. Marino is a biophysicist and is a professor with the Department of Orthopedics. Dr. Marino has done a considerable amount of research and has written textbooks on electromagnetic fields. And so we're going to get into the subject in some depth and try and be practical. The first question I'd like to ask Andy is, what is an electromagnetic field?
It is a region around any device that uses electricity, which contains energy. It is an energy field that surrounds anything that uses electricity: a shaver, a dryer, an electric light, a microwave oven. It's a necessary consequence of that device using electricity.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about your background in this area, which you've actually studied for a long time, so the audience knows.
Well, my work began with attempts to understand how very weak electrical signals, electromagnetic signals, could be detected by the body. Our aim was to be able to give a physician a certain amount of control over growth. We wanted to be able to treat diseases, for example, using specially designed electromagnetic signals, and much of my work still is in that direction. As a consequence of those kinds of studies, we began animal studies that were sort of a first step before we would do human studies. And in these animal studies, we found some adverse changes. And when we realized that the signal that we were using in these studies was similar to signals that were present in the environment, potential health risk issues came into consideration, and I've worked on those ever since.
So you've actually studied the effect of these fields on the animal model?
On cells, on animals, and on people. There's certain studies that are appropriate to do with electromagnetic fields and human beings.
And what the idea of all this was, of course, to study the possible harmful effects, but also to study, what force can be used to stimulate healing, I think, is what you're probably talking about.
The initial studies were geared towards stimulating healing, in particular bone healing. In the course of doing those studies, the possibility that under certain conditions fields could do things other than something that was desirable came into being. We realized it was a potential problem. And over the last few years, that area of EMF work, I think, has gotten more publicity and become more of a subject of concern and a focus of funding than has the beneficial use. Okay. I mean, electromagnetic fields are something that have no intrinsic value in themselves. They, like a gun or a knife, they could be used for good or for evil. And there are questions on both sides of that issue with regard to fields.
And, for years we ignored even that they had an existence. We kind of acted as though there wasn't such a thing, that we knew there was maybe something coming off power lines, and we knew that there might be something coming off the electrical apparatuses that we use. But I think the general consensus was that there certainly could be nothing bad about the electromagnetic having trouble with the word, magnetic fields were generated by all these gadgets that we use day in and day out, especially the housewife.
That's true. The possibility of harm was not directly considered. The general notion that evolved was that if you didn't stick your fingers into the electrical outlet, or you stick your fist into the microwave oven and have this immediate bad effect occur, and as long as you didn't do that, as long as you didn't touch the power line wire, then that meant that you would be safe. That was a kind of That was a presumption. I mean, that belonged to a more naive time. We just know now that that's not true.
Can you name any specific diseases that you think there's a potential for EMF to treat in the future?
Well, the class of diseases that have already been approved in terms of the federal government and the FDA for use with regard to electromagnetic fields are diseases that are orthopedic in nature, a fracture that doesn't heal, for example, a certain condition involving the loss of blood to a portion of the bone, and perhaps osteoporosis, although that's just under study now. Where we might go in the future is very hard to predict, because it's going to depend on coming to grips in a better fashion with the actual mechanism by which the field does what it does. Keep in mind that where we are now is that we have reason to believe that fields do something. We have empirical evidence, but we don't know how. We haven't identified, for example, the place in the body that the body actually recognizes the existence of the field.
That's right. The big area of controversy, of course, is over potential health risks. And at least my gathering from the news media is that most of our homes could or should be evaluated with this Gauss meter. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
With a Gauss meter. And the Gauss meter apparently is an instrument which actually measures the force of these fields and records it in milligauss, like millirads and meters. How accurate is a Gauss meter?
Well, let me say first of all that the electromagnetic fields we're talking about come in different magnitudes and have different characteristics. A Gauss meter would be used to measure the magnetic component of the field. Another meter, an electric field meter, would measure the electric component of the field. And there's still a third electromagnetic field that people would be familiar with and would probably be concerned about, and that would be the electromagnetic field that's similar to the one that's in a microwave oven, or that makes a cellular telephone work, or a police radar gun work. There are three separate species of electromagnetic field, all of which have separate instruments to measure them. The measurements can be made to any degree of accuracy one cares to make, great precision if you care to make the measurement. The difficulty is not in making the measurement, it's in interpreting the biological significance or meaning of the measurement. That's where the rub comes in.
So the Gauss meter is merely measuring the electromagnetic field and doesn't measure the other two components that you're talking about?
That's correct.
And are there meters that measure those components?
Yes, there are.
The Gauss meter is probably most of the people that watch television have heard of a Gauss meter. And what you're pointing out is that we have major other areas that have to be evaluated for health risks, and it's not just what is measured by the Gauss meter that's
correct.
important.
That's correct.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the health risks. You know, the Swedish government has come up with very rigid guidelines as to how close one can build schools and homes. They actually are measuring with Gaussometers, Gauss meters, and they are really convinced in Sweden that Gauss, or the electromagnetic fields, probably increase leukemia risks in children. Now, the data in this country, I don't think is quite that clear.
Well, the Swedish study you're talking about involved children who live beside high voltage power lines. The reason the study was done was because there was a study done in the United States in 1986 that reported a similar observation done by a group from North Carolina, actually down in the Denver area in 1986. And the reason that was done was because there was a similar study reported in Stockholm, Sweden in 1985. And the reason that was done was because there was a similar study reported in 1979, again out of Denver. So we've seen a series of now 5 studies that have all pointed to the same conclusion. And it's not, most people I think would agree that it's not the power of any one study, but it's the power of a series of studies that are all geared at the same kind, asking the same kind of a question: is there a link between children who live beside power line and the likelihood that those children will get cancer?
So you think there are 5 major studies now to look at?
Oh, there's no question about that, and that's the factor that's leading the Swedish government to consider making these changes.
And at least the data that I've seen indicates that the one area in which there is probably or maybe a strong link is in the area of childhood leukemia.
Well, it depends on how we want to define a strength. If by strength we mean association between something in the environment and one kind of cancer, I'd say yes. On the other hand, there are about 20 studies of occupationally exposed individuals. These would be mostly men, very few studies involving women, who are occupationally exposed to electromagnetic fields because they're electronic engineers or electrical engineers.
Well, they may be linemen.
Or linemen, that's one of the categories. Electrical welders. There's actually 11 electrical occupations, the way our government classifies occupations, that fit this label of being occupationally exposed. Now, in this group of studies I'm talking about, more than the expected numbers of cancers were observed. That is to say, these exposed individuals had a higher rate than would have been expected for individuals of the same age and ethnic distribution, but not exposed to electromagnetic fields. But in those studies, mostly it was cancer in general and not one particular form of cancer. So if you shade the question a little bit and ask if it refers to all cancer, I say those studies are pretty important.
So what you're saying is that we don't know, but there might be a link between electromagnetic fields and a wide variety of cancers, not just childhood leukemia.
That's correct. And the question of how certain you'd want to be before you agree that this link actually exists is where much of the dispute is today. I mean, you have a certain interest in protecting yourself, and somebody who provides the electromagnetic field, say a power company, has an interest in individuals not getting cancer, but their attitude toward the degree of risk could very well be different.
What seems to me as a layperson that there should be data collectible among individuals who have a high exposure to EMF. And you would think that there'd be more clear information than there is, because it seems that there just isn't any clear information other than maybe a risk of slightly above the normal population, even for people who work all day under these high-intensity power lines.
Well, you know, when you talk about what's clear, I think you have to have a reference to the clarity that exists broadly in medicine, at least in environmentally related medicine. It seems to me that with the possible exception of smoking and asbestos, although I'm not sure about asbestos, the quality and character of the information we have with regard to EMFs far exceeds all other factors. So, and in our society, you know, we get what we pay for. If we don't pay for more detailed research, the situation will be exactly where it is now.
Well, let's touch on some other areas that put out a lot of electromagnetic fields. An area that concerns me because I sleep on a waterbed. And in fact, in the Times, in the Sunday issue, first Sunday in January, had a nice write-up on the potential harm of electromagnetic fields, and I thought it was a fairly unbiased article. So any in the audience that want to read more detail, the Sunday, January 3rd Shreveport Times did emphasize this in quite a bit of detail. And it made me nervous because it covered the area of shavers, electric heaters for water beds. What about an electric heater for a water bed?
Well, as best we can tell now, the exposure that is related to a risk to health involves two things about the electromagnetic field. It involves how strong it is, and it involves how long it's present. That is to say, the dose involves time and strength of the field to which you're exposed. An electric waterbed and an electric blanket for the ordinary individual represent probably the highest dose that would be experienced. With the exception of living beside a high voltage power line, it's in a class by itself in terms of the dose of electromagnetic fields it gives. because the field intensities are relatively high and you use it for a relatively long period of time. If you look at an ordinary water electric blanket or electric water bed heater, you'll find that it's on. It's what we call duty cycle, or the time that it's on versus off in a typical 8-hour period. On a given night might be 25 or 30%. So it might be 2 or 3 hours that it's actually on. And during that time, since you're so close to the electrical conductor, you're very close to the electric field and the magnetic field. So you get a good dose from both aspects. High voltage power lines present essentially the same kind of problem. Everything else is in a class that's much reduced in terms of the dose it provides. Electric shaver is a good example. It provides a relatively high field, but the duration of use is very brief, a few minutes a day, so that when you multiply the strength of the field times the time, the number would be relatively small.
So if you're going to list risks, it would probably be somebody who works with power lines, under power lines, somebody who, like, is a welder and works with electrical equipment all day, someone who uses an electric blanket, someone who sleeps on a water bed which uses electricity to heat the water. Who else would you say is at high risk for getting a lot of field?
In terms of the ordinary household or office environment, I think the field is relatively low, except for the electric blanket and
How
the water
about
bed.
people operating computers?
Even today, we do not have a good measure of the fields produced by a computer. The fields produced by an electric blanket or a high voltage power line are, from an engineering point of view, easy to characterize. The field from a computer, a VDT terminal, is dirty. It's very messy. It has many frequencies. So it varies quite a bit from instrument to instrument, from make to make. So, we know they are a source of electromagnetic fields, but how one is to weigh them compared to these other factors is presently not known.
So at the present time, are you nervous about this enough so that if you were walking down a street and there were power lines on one side of the street, would you cross to the other side of the street?
No,
because there were power lines.
There's not any. That's ought to be understood clearly what we're talking about here. These risks are all found in association with long-term exposure. That is to say, in all the studies I've talked about up until now, the minimum exposure is a year, and in many cases, in the childhood leukemia studies, for example, some exposures are 18 years in length. So we're not talking about something that's associated with a brief or a transitory exposure, such as you just described. It's the risk, whatever it is, and however it's to be measured, is associated, based on what we know now, with long-term exposure.
So you think that's pretty extreme to walk across the street and avoid the power line? On the other hand, if you were looking at buying a house,
that's another matter.
You might avoid buying a house that was near high power current.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the area of study, because I feel there is not enough research being conducted into the effect, both good and bad, of EMF and the other forces that you alluded to. What do you think should be done, Andy?
Well, it's clear now what has to be done, and I think the forces are in motion to do it. There has to be money made available to independent scientists through standard agencies like the National Institutes of Health, for example, and investigators who have no particular allegiance, but have just good, sound experimental plans have got to be funded, and the work has got to be done out in the open and made available to everybody. That hasn't been the case in the past, and it's got to be the way in the future. That's clear.
How much trust is there right now at the federal level? It sounds like this almost has to be conducted by a non-biased federal agency, or maybe all the companies that deliver electromagnetic force would get together and donate money to a private study. But I agree with you, all the studies done so far have had tainted views because they have their own parochial interest in what's going to happen.
The studies have got to be done so that the data is available to the scientific community, regardless of what it may be. And that's the way data that comes from a grant becomes generally available. A grant is money given to someone to do research, and then that research belongs to the public generally. When research is done under a contract, then the research actually belongs to the people who paid for it. They may or may not release it. So and that's the pattern we followed actually since June of '76 up until now, and that's not in the public interest in my view. And it's now, I mean, it's now apparent to everyone that's not the way to do research. There is ongoing now a dialogue within Congress. We're sure of that because Congress has evinced a desire to fund research. It has not made a decision who will control the research. It might be the Department of Energy. It might be the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. We just don't know now. But it will be money available to independent scientists, really in terms of substantial amounts proportionate to the problem, really for the first time.
Now it will be purely in the area of electromagnetic fields. Not, are they going to study all these areas of concern from the power of electricity?
It will, the mission of the program will be as Congress designs it. The way Congress appears to be leaning toward a design, it will demand that the people who administer the money obtain an answer to the fundamental question: are electromagnetic fields in the environment a health risk? And if so, under what conditions does this risk come into being? I mean, point it out so we can eliminate it and avoid it. That'll be, I think, the thrust. And then following that will be, I think, other studies aimed at understanding mechanisms. Because only when you understand mechanisms do you have true scientific understanding of what's going on. Although that's not at all necessary to answer the fundamental societal questions, risk.
Andy, how many years do you think it'll take before we actually have enough data to say what we should and shouldn't be doing? Do you think, for example, the Swedes have been a little premature in some of their concerns and guidelines for the public in Sweden? Well,
first of all, Sweden has not, in terms of a governmental way, acted. There is ongoing in Sweden exactly the same kind of debate that's ongoing here in terms of what the level of protection ought to be, because every level of protection that's mandated has a financial cost, and the government, unlike the scientist who's concerned only about the scientific matters and about making judgments of risk, the government or the agency has got the truly difficult problem of balancing out that risk, whatever it may be, with the cost that it takes to ameliorate or relieve that risk. It's really a much more difficult question as far as I'm concerned, one that I'm glad I'm not faced with. The same kind of what the risk is and what ought to be spent in order to deal with it is ongoing in Sweden now and really hasn't been settled. But it's important to understand that this is not a Swedish decision based on evidence available just to them. It really sits at the tip of the iceberg of epidemiological studies, that is to say, studies involving individuals who were exposed, that goes back to 1979, and laboratory studies that go back to 1971. So it's for them the end of the road toward beginning the recognition of the problem, and nothing more than that.
To get practical in another area, which I think is another area of force delivery, on Larry King Live, a great stir was created because a lady was on actually her husband was on, and she claimed that a glioblastoma, I think, a brain tumor, was specifically related to her use of a cellular telephone. And you know, that, of course, massively stirred up the nation because numerous business-type people, as you see them walking down the street, it's almost like they've got an extension on their hand because they're constantly talking on a cellular telephone. That's a little different type of energy, isn't it?
Well, it's in terms of the type of energy, it's quite comparable to the type of energy that it's in a microwave oven. The strength of the field is different. It doesn't cook your ear because the strength is lower. But if you looked at the physical signature of the energy in an oscilloscope, for example, it would look very similar to the signature of the energy in a microwave oven.
And that's really scary when you think about it. If there really is a specific danger to that, you know. And I think there have been few things that stirred up the nation as much as that program that Larry King had. And then there was a program before that. Didn't you say that there was a national program? What was that stirred this up?
That involved the well, there was a section on Larry King Live that involved high voltage power lines.
Right.
So it went from high voltage power lines, which is the same issue as cellular telephones, and I expect shortly you'll see one on police radar.
Yes.
It's the same issue. It's the same studies that are involved in terms of basing a judgment of risk. And it's the same physical mechanism that exists in all three cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, it may be that the companies which manufacture instruments that do emit potentially harmful fields will come up with some device by which these fields can be protected from the user. In other words, by some sort of a shield. And it may be that, don't you think that we might consider doing something that way before we're absolutely certain that it is or is not harmful?
Well, there's something that will probably happen first. One of the reasons I think there's a reluctance to let this happen is that the lawyers for the corporations, I think, see some legal ramifications. But if an industry recognizes the possibility of a harm, it doesn't have to admit to anything or agree that anything caused anything, but just agree that there's enough of a possibility of a harm that we're going to do things differently. For example, there's no reason why the electric blanket that you use has got to make as strong a magnetic field as in fact it does. It just so happens that's the way the engineer designed it. The engineer could redesign it, change the wires in a certain way so that the field that you were exposed to was much less. And the blanket would work the same way and would cost the same amount. It's just that it wasn't done that way initially, and now I sense a reluctance to change to meet the condition of a lower field, because that in some sense might be seen as an admission that there was in fact something wrong.
You see that actually went on in medical circles. You know, that if you admitted, say, that some procedure you had done and resulted in some injury, that, say, correcting that injury without cost to the patient was an admission of guilt. And I think that's pretty well been shattered by litigation within this country. So, but on the other hand, I know the cellular telephone people, I have not read their brochures. But on this program it was brought out that they actually have inserted warning information into the brochures for the cellular telephones that this might be harmful with extensive use.
That's one of the steps that ought to be taken, and has traditionally not been taken in the past. If you bought a house beside a high voltage power line, there was never any hint that the best face I think that could have been put on the situation would be that there's a controversy and no one's sure.
Okay.
At least you ought to be aware of that. There wasn't a hint of that.
Well, now in our last few minutes, do you have any advice to the listener that could be fairly simplistic until we know more?
Be prudent. If there's a practical way to avoid being exposed to electromagnetic fields, don't do it.
Keep it like in the kitchen, keep a distance.
Keep a distance.
Use a hair dryer as little as possible, probably. Don't hang around with a cellular telephone constantly.
That's right.
You know, all these little things until we know more and until the manufacturers put in some safety mechanisms within the instruments themselves. And I think we're going to see a big change going on in the manufacturer's approach to this, because I think they truly are worried that litigation here could be truly humongous.
Yes.
Well, this has been a very interesting program, and we hope that we've brought some information to your house, and hope to bring programs like this to you again in the future. Thank you very much for watching this evening.
The preceding was produced by the LSU Medical Center in Shreveport, Department of Medical Communication.